Hello, welcome to Chapter 1 for PSY 235 Social Psychology. In this video, we'll be covering Learning Objective 1.1, just sort of getting us started, getting ourselves grounded in what social psychology is. First, we're going to be defining the field and then looking at where social psychology lands in that space among other disciplines, some of which are related, some of which are quite distinct. So first, how do social psychologists define what they do? The most common definition comes from Allport, who talks about social psychology as the scientific study of how people think, feel, and act in response to the presence of other people, whether those people are actually in front of us at the moment or whether we're imagining their reactions to things that we do, or if we're imagining their thoughts and feelings. All of those things represent what we call social influence. Social influence basically means that other people, either thinking about who they are and what they're thinking, feeling, and doing, or we're responding directly to actual people in our environment, those interactions influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So what social psychologists are interested in is how and why just being in that social environment can actually shape how we feel, what kind of cognitive reactions or thoughts we have, and what kind of decisions we make about how to behave. Social psychology, like all of psychology, is a science. We use the same kinds of methods and processes that all of the other sciences do to find objective answers to questions that we have. So, for instance, in human social behavior, we have lots of important questions to answer, like what causes aggression? How can we make prejudice less prevalent? What kind of variables encourage people to like each other or even fall in love? And what kind of advertisements actually work? Specifically, we could ask questions about political advertising as well. The way we go about asking and answering questions is by using empirical methods. We use the scientific approach of creating research questions, deriving hypotheses, testing those hypotheses using a variety of methods, and then determining whether or not our hypotheses are supported by the data that we find. Now, social psychology is one of those fields. I kind of think of it as a bridge field or a linking science, which connects a lot of other disciplines and is influenced by a lot of other disciplines. So starting our conversation about that, we can look at the way in which fields like biology and neuroscience interact with social psychology. One of the most prominent theoretical perspectives that has had an impact on social psychology in the last couple of decades is evolutionary psychology, which attempts to explain and understand human social interactions in terms of patterns of thoughts, feelings, and actions that have evolved over time through natural selection. So, for example, why would people be helpful? Why would they engage in helpful behaviors that actually put them at risk? Well, the evolutionary explanation of that is by being helpful to others, we increase the likelihood that they will help us in return, and that actually has the impact of making us more successful. On the neuroscience front, and this is a relatively recent field to have an impact on the study of social psychology, is that we now have an entire subdiscipline called social neuroscience, where you're taking that cross-disciplinary approach of biology, chemistry, and brain sciences to understand how it is that human social interactions arise and what governs them. So, for example, you might have a social neuroscientist who wants to understand at a brain level where aggression comes from, or how angry feelings develop and sometimes turn into decisions to behave aggressively. Personality psychology historically has a longer tradition of being kind of enmeshed with social psychology. My PhD program, in fact, was called a social personality program, because so many of the theories that we use as grounds for our research come from this overlapping space between personality psychology, which tends to focus on theories of individual traits and characteristics and where they come from. But it also, personality theories tend to make predictions about how people will act in various social situations, like what will their relationships be like, what will their emotional reactions to situations be like, and so on. What will their thought patterns be like in social contexts? So there's a natural kind of interaction between our two fields. Personality psychologists do tend to be more individually focused. So they're looking at the person and describing the person's traits. And they may even talk about how some of those traits are created, some describing them as inborn, others describing them as learned. Social psychologists use what personality psychologists study to look at individual differences across social situations. So, for example, when we get into the helping behavior chapter, there will be a discussion of something called the altruistic personality. So some researchers argue that there's a particular cluster of traits that some people have that make them extra helpful, extra concerned, extra empathetic in response to other people. The personality psychologist would be creating the measure to document that and validate it. The social psychologist would ask the question, okay, how do people high and low in those altruistic traits behave in an emergency, in a helping situation? What we do in social psychology is we look at the power of the social situation to impact people. Because in some situations, your personality, your traits, your underlying tendencies, in some situations, they will come through very clear. In other situations, though, you will react to the situation and you will behave in a way that is very uncharacteristic of you. So, for example, if you have a very introverted person, but it happens to be that person's birthday, they may go out with all their friends, go a little crazy, have a lot of fun, out at their party, which does not match their underlying trait of introversion, but the situation demands it. So that's what we call the power of the situation. A concept that we're going to be using the entire semester is something called a construal. People construct understandings of their environments, and that shapes the thoughts we have about those environments, the feelings we have in response to them, and so on. And that too stems from personality psychology. So these two fields are really intimately connected. Similarly, sociology. I often talk about social psychology as a hybrid of sociology and psychology. There are differences, of course. Sociology deals with group level variables. So you're talking about things like social class, social structure, social institutions, because our societies are made up of those dimensions. Psychologists tend to look at the individual. So for a social psychologist, we look at the individual in a social context. Sociologists, in contrast, tend to focus on why would an entire group of people within a society engage in certain kinds of behaviors. For example, they may compare cultures at different points in time and try and explain how do patterns of behavior, like, say, criminality, for example, how do they change? The major difference between sociology and social psychology is essentially the level of analysis. Psychology tends to lean in the direction of not looking at those big groups, but instead looking at the person, the individual, Sociology tends to look at many of the exact same variables, things like aggression, altruism, prejudice, etc., but they're looking at it at the group level. Our goal as social psychologists is to look for, although we don't tend to find completely universal properties, but we're looking for principles that help us understand human nature, understand why people do what they do, think what they think, and feel what they feel. While these are distinct disciplines, they are highly, highly interrelated, and they overlap. So despite the fact that the social psychologist tends to look at the individual level of analysis, you will find that sociologists and social psychologists cross-pollinate all the time. We tend to study the same things and publish across each other's journals. So there's a lot of overlap between our disciplines. So just to review, looking at these different disciplines, with biology and neuroscience, you're talking about looking at genes, hormones, physiological processes, but also the big picture process of evolution and genetics for helping us understand social behavior. Personality psychology helps us to document individual differences, those things that make us unique from one another, and look at them in a social context. Sociology is that big picture approach, looking at groups, organizations, societies rather than individuals. And then social psychology, which we're studying here, we're looking at the ways in which social influence can impact individual thoughts, feelings, and actions when we're in a social context. Now, that phrase, social context, I'm going to say that about a bazillion times over the course of this semester. So, be on the lookout for that, because that will be a constantly revisited concept. The other one you're going to hear all the time throughout this course is a construct. There is this underlying assumption in social psychology that human beings have evolved the capacity to derive meaning from their environments. We construct reality as we are experiencing it, and that's a really critical thing that we're going to be thinking about for the entire semester. So that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 1.1.